This challenge, the challenge of adjacent operations and the effect they have on each other, are not new in agriculture. You in the Valley know them very well, right? In fact, many of the issues around Sigma have to do with adjacency, having to do with drawing from groundwater. But more importantly, we can think of the examples of cotton. Cotton, as you know, requires defoliation in order to be harvested. That defoliation actually can cause impacts on surrounding crops, right? We can think about it around pollinators and spray regimes and harvest regimes that disrupt the flow and the nature of native pollinators and introduce pollinators and how they affect crops. We see adjacency issues as they relate to agriculture at the edge of the urban interface. So adjacency problems are things that we've worked with before. And I want to just suggest to you that's one of the challenges that we have here. Now, gentlemen, what we're going to do today, just simple. You've done it, Justin. I've got a few questions for you both. They're kind of the things you can do on the stand-up. And I think we should just get started. So, Dan, take us inside the fresh produce operation today. What are the sort of market and regulatory pressures that are driving the LGMA today, that drove the changes in the LGMA that we've recently seen? What is it? What's the crucible that your LGMA growers are in right now?
Okay. So I think it's important to understand that the LGMA exists to protect public health. The LGMA was created in 2007 after the spinach outbreak in 2006. And the goal of the creation of the LGMA was to protect public health, and that remains the same today. The LGMA was designed to be flexible and to be a system that could be adapted when new information comes about. That's been proven several times over the history of the LGMA. And just recently, in the last year, we have undergone very significant changes in our water protocols because of the 2 Romaine outbreaks in 2018. The LGMA, by far, when it comes to food safety, is probably on the forefront of food safety programs in the nation. One of the challenges, though, is that everybody's got a better mousetrap. Everybody has a better system. So on a day-to-day basis, as a producer of leafy greens, we have to follow the LGMA requirements, but we also have buyer requirements that sometimes go above and beyond. We have to follow this buyer's requirements, which are slightly different. And we have to juggle the fact that we have to combine all those to give us our food safety program. And there's not one that's the same. So it takes a staff of people with the knowledge, with the understanding, with boots on the ground to make sure that we're not only complying with the LGMA requirements, with FSMA requirements, with our third-party auditor requirements, with our buyer requirements, and all this is in the effort of protecting public health and the consumers of our product. I like to say that, I've got 3 small children, and the products that we grow out on our farms come to my dinner table almost nightly. I do it for my kids. I do it for my family. I do it for all the consumers that eat our products. And every member of the LGMA also feels that way. We're passionate about protecting public health and delivering a safe and wholesome food to the dinner table every day.
No, that's great. But before you take it off, I want to ask you a question. No doubt LGMA is about public health. But there's also a tremendous amount of economic pressure as well. Give us a sense. What was the impact of the Romaine crisis economically on the industry?
So, and I'm a little background on that. In the outbreak we had in the fall of last year, 2018, right around November, a few days before the Thanksgiving holiday, there was an advisory given by the FDA to not consume, not ship, not harvest, or put into commerce romaine. And we really rely on the produce industry on those significant holidays. I mean, Thanksgiving, Christmas, 4th of July, sales of salads go up. Okay? So in this last Thanksgiving, the market came to a standstill. Now, we don't travel back and forth between California and the desert region, but I still had romaine in the ground on our ranches. I had about 30 acres, the last part of my romaine plantings, that were never harvested. So when you take a commodity out of distribution, it has significant impacts. And not only on the sales side, the amount of employees that were laid off because there was no harvest. The processing plants couldn't put that romaine into the salad mixes they produce. You think about the number of people that didn't work for that period of time when that advisory was in is significant. Significant for all of you too. Because if you wanted a romaine salad or a Caesar salad with your Thanksgiving dinner, you were probably not able to go to the store and find a head of romaine there. And it's important to understand romaine is the most highly consumed leafy green out of that whole family. It wasn't available. So it had a very, very significant impact.
Thank you. So, Justin, same thing. California dairy and cattle operations also live in a complex marketplace, lots of pressures, a lot of regulatory pressures, a lot of scrutiny, particularly in the dairy industry as it relates to almost everything, GHGs, water, you name it.
Right.
Take us inside what's your industry facing right now.
So I'll take a step back first and first say that I represent the California Cattlemen Association, which represents beef cattle producers, but as a key part of that, feedlot operators, calf ranches, and others that predominantly produce cattle for fed beef. We have a pretty strong presence of fed cattle still in California. California actually used to be the #1 feeding state in the country, largely due to our weather. Consolidation of our beef packing plants, just sort of the forage that's grown for cattle on feed. A lot of that's moved to the Midwest, but we still have considerable population of cattle here. These facilities tend to be larger, much larger than a dairy, and concentrated into very specific areas of the state, southern San Joaquin Valley, and largely in the Imperial Valley, where we have over 500,000 cattle on feed at any one time, which we also have a pretty prominent leafy green industry that moves down from Salinas and other places down to the desert Southwest to grow during their third growing season. So we don't have any market or regulatory challenges, so I guess we can probably just stop that now.
Just go ahead then. I'm glad to hear it.
So I think, I started off on Tuesday talking a bit about the fact that when it comes to food safety, when it comes to having the same pressures that impact our producers, both from the buyers, the processors, and overall the consumers, we see that on a daily basis. We are very much in tune to food safety issues and how they impact our operations all the way down the chain. I think many of you probably, everybody looks old enough in this room to remember the Jack in the Box scare that occurred many years ago, which prompted the U.S. beef industry to take a real hard look at food safety metrics. And they invested millions of dollars in looking at how are we going to ensure a healthy, safe, and wholesome product is delivered to our consumers, and that our consumers are going to feel confident about eating these products. And so a good percentage of that research and a good percent of that money was invested in a series of very robust, very comprehensive food safety measures in our beef packing plants that really remove E. coli from the ability to be transmitted out into our food packaging world, in the meat case. Now, of course, you all see that we still have beef recalls, so we're not immune to any of these recalls that cause considerable economic harm to the industry. But at the same time, we know, and I guess our industry has come to realize, that you can't always control or eliminate the presence of E. coli in the feed yard setting, and even in the cow-calf setting. And so we set out to do what we thought was most effective, and that's really to look at where do we eliminate the presence of pathogens and that's on the product itself. So they go through a series, I'm not going to get into that, but go through a series of very comprehensive food safety measures as that carcass moves from that animal's harvested, actually prior to harvest, all the way up until that carcass is broken down for various cuts. So some of the things that we sort of represent, and there's a fact sheet in the document or in the papers that you've been given today. Just keep in mind those are largely more specific to the cattle feeding industry, and some of which are more even specific to the Imperial Valley. But in terms of air quality, in terms of water quality, in all areas of the state, these facilities are regulated, whether it's through APCD 4550, 4570 in the San Joaquin Valley, to similar rules in the Imperial Valley, to water quality rules here, both for dairy and for feedlots in the Central Valley, as well as water quality regulations down there. A little bit different up here, focus more on groundwater. Down in the Imperial Valley, focus more on surface water. But that being said, these are heavily regulated facilities, many of which have, not unlike the Leafy Green industries, have environmental compliance staff on the payroll, on site at all times to ensure that monthly inspections are dealt with, yearly inspections by regulators are taken care of, proper documents are processed, and the work that needs to be done in order to be compliant is done as well. So I don't know any. Go ahead.
Actually, that's perfect. Keep the mic. So let's talk about some of the specific things that happen in these operations, particularly larger scale operations, that are designed to reduce the impact of raising cattle, whether it's for beef or for dairy, on the surrounding neighborhood. So what are the practices that go on these farms and ranches and dairies?
Sure, I'll mention a couple of them. And given the fact that we're in Stockton in the Central Valley, I certainly want my dairy colleagues to definitely have an opportunity to participate in the question and answer period, because they're going to speak a lot more to the individual environmental metrics and measures that they use on their facilities. But from the cattle operation side, largely we're looking at really controlling two things. One is dust and other criteria pollutants, but I'm going to not talk about that today because I think what's more germane to this discussion is the dust, and then water quality. And so from a dust perspective, California feed yards are a bit unique compared to other feed yards and throughout the country. All of our I have not seen a feed yard in California that is not providing shade for the cattle, which that may not sound to you like an environmental measure, that may sound like more like an animal welfare measure, but it's actually an environmental measure. It's both, actually, because it limits cattle movement during the hottest times of the day, which when we're raising cattle in feedlots, typically they are in hotter regions of the state. And also our pens are routinely watered to ensure that there's necessary dust suppression. And that's, again, not just from a PM10 standpoint, fugitive dust emissions, it's also for the health and welfare of the cattle, to control and reduce respiratory diseases. But in addition to that, it also helps keep any fugitive dust emissions that might otherwise contain pathogens or anything else on the feed yard to the feed yard itself. Water quality-wise, again, up here, the focus is more groundwater. But that being said, the rules up here also ensure that facilities are designed to keep all surface water on site. Unlike dairy, we don't operate where we have continual flush systems, whether it's in milk barns or freestall barns. So all of our facilities are designed so when you do have a rainfall event and you have stormwater runoff, that all of that travels into a pond and that evaporates over time. Ponds are, again, largely a mechanism not just to control surface water, but also to protect discharges to groundwater. But bottom line, I think, if I could leave you with anything, is we don't discharge to surface water. So if there's a concern that there is wastewater leaving a feedlot, particularly, that is not happening. Facilities would be in serious trouble and serious fines, potentially jail in some cases, could be brought against that facility and those owners. We do also have certain measures on the feed yard that we look at specifically for food safety. I think the environmental measures that I mentioned a few minutes ago, they of course translate over to really also providing a food safety component, specifically as it relates to dust. But other things that we do, most cattle feeders feed a supplement at their own expense. They're not refunded for at any point in the food chain. That diminishes and restricts the production of E. coli, O157H7, and other harmful pathogens in the gut of the rumen. And so you have less prevalence of shedding in those cattle. Again, that's something that we do. We pay for, feed on our own. Other thing is pretty serious insect control. Believe it or not, most feed yards you go to, one of the first things you'll notice is that there's not a lot of flies around. We take insect control very seriously. Again, there are obviously implications associated with potentially food safety and crops being grown next door. Hold on 1 second if I could just finish. But also, again, from an animal health and welfare perspective, controlling pink eye and other diseases that might be spread from one animal to the other.
What are some of the practical things that are being done on farms today as it relates to reducing food safety risks?
So there are several significant areas, and again, the LGMA and our food safety approach is to be proactive. It's not a reactionary program. It's trying to be proactive all the way from germination and all the way through harvest to its shipping point. So a lot of the things that we are observing kind of in the big buckets, and there's a lot of details in these buckets. The first is water. And again, we've undergone a very significant change in our water requirements here in the last 2 months. We also look at environmental issues. And part of environmental issues is adjacent lands, our neighbors. And, I'm not, yes, there are cattle operations adjacent to some of ours, but it's bigger than that. It's things like hobby farms. Maybe being next to an open space where you could have the prevalence of wild pigs, deer. So putting control measures in place to try to mitigate those. Our adjacent land issues are something that we can only control so much. We can't go to our neighbor and say, you gotta go take your chickens and move them 800 feet. It's their operation, so we have to try to do as much mitigation as we can on our side, but that's not entirely in our control. The other thing that we are constantly doing is evaluating our employee practices and employee hygiene. Again, a lot of our crops are hand harvested. There are a set of hands touching each head of produce that gets to your dinner table. Mechanization is coming around, and that may balance things out, but for right now, we're still very, very reliant on manual labor. And these workers that harvest these crops, and so they have to go through an abundant amount of training. And it's about their hygiene. It's about the way that they conduct themselves in the field, proper sanitation. And what all this comes into is that we're trying to create this culture. So all of these come under the umbrella of setting up a food safety culture on all of our leafy greens operations. And one of the biggest things is that these aren't just rules. There's always a why behind for the reason we do things. There's always a why. And so really understanding that why helps embody this food safety culture that we strive for day in and day out.
Perfect. Thank you. Now, one last question before we're going to go. We're not really going to do Q&A. We're going to have a little town hall, so I'll explain it. So keep the mic for a second. If there was one thing, one opportunity for us to work more effectively with our neighbors, particularly our neighbors from the cattle industry, the dairy industry, the folks who are in the room here today, from your perspective, what is it that you would hope for? What's that one thing?
So, and I'll promise I'll get to your question.
I promise.
So
I'm sure you will.
I actually wanted to speak. This is about my third or fourth time being at the same room with Justin, and The first time was all right. So in each subsequent...
I'm bigger than him, though, so it's okay.
I run a little faster, so it works. But it,
Get out of the way.
no, that was a Wiley safety barrier. Come on back. No, but in each subsequent meeting, the conversations have gotten more towards what do we do? Where we go? How can we work on this? Because I think from our level, we understand that neither one of us is going to be able to do this completely on our own because we are two very different agriculture industries. But we are doing the same thing, and that is providing food to the consumer. So there's a lot we have in common. And so just a few weeks ago, I went down to the get proper titles. The Feeder Council meeting. Scott Horsfall, the CEO of LGMA, and myself went down and did a presentation on the LGMA. And, I'll say Scott and I kind of walked in, just walking in kind of quiet, but we did our presentation and was very receptive. They were great hosts, phenomenal questions from the cattle industry towards us. And where this is all getting to is I think we really have to understand each other's process. I think we have to share that because I think when I was sitting through their conference, I'm listening to some of the presentations and I go, I've been in the exact same talk with produce industry. They're facing, we face a lot of the same challenges. That's common ground. And I think the bigger issues that we need to work through starts with identifying what we do have in common, which is a lot. But I think that helps us start to work through where we need to, the difficult items. But I think that open dialogue and the ability to sit down, talk things out, not always agree, but I think that understanding of that we're trying to achieve a common goal so that we can be good neighbors and that we can coexist because we need to coexist has started. And I think this is another opportunity to kind of help form that bond that this can go on. And I think it's positive. And, again, I look forward to continuing to work with Justin and the group because we've had wonderful dialogues on possible ideas of things that we can do moving forward.
Excellent. What's that one thing or that one aspiration that you see us in terms of moving us forward?
So I definitely would agree with Dan. It's definitely communication. And I will, reinforce the message when we first... And I know that this workshop came together primarily of some instances that might have occurred as of late, but this has not been something that is new to us. This is something we've been working on now for over 2 years. And so the first couple of meetings that we had did not go so well. They were not necessarily the best in terms of communicating well with each other. And I would definitely agree. As folks have come to the table and had a discussion on these issues, that's progressively gotten a lot better. So I think from our perspective, it's really finding the way to dialogue with your neighbor and the way that we dialogue again, appropriately with the LGMA, Western growers, and others on this issue. I think that needs to be really the kind of crux of how we find ways to coexist. And I think from the perspective of moving the issue forward outside of just determining that we do share common ground and we can effectively grow produce next to a livestock operation and being able to communicate that to each other is also how we're going to advance getting better information and more data. And that doesn't just include educating each other about the certain food safety metrics that we have to adhere to or the principles or best practices that we follow, but it's also working collectively to better understand the liability and the threat of what many perceive to be risks to food safety from a livestock operation, and then having a shared commitment to develop metrics and a shared commitment from both sides to develop metrics that relate and reflect that research. And so I think, from my perspective, it's one, communication, and two, making sure there's a shared commitment by both industries to keep our metrics and our food safety practices science-based. And next year we expect FDA to come out with a warning on turkey. So we'll
Let's give these guys a
Yeah.
hand.